This is John Nash. At just 22 years old, this prodigy from West Virginia earned a PhD for his revolutionary work in game theory, now called the Nash equilibrium. But would you believe that this man would end up spending his next 30 years in a mental asylum? For decades, his gifted mind was filled with delusions, and his once promising career was reduced to nothing. This is the tragic story of the man whose genius burned brighter than most, only to be dimmed by his imagination. Born on the 13th of June in 1928 in the humble town of Bluefield, West Virginia, young Nash was blessed with parents who held education in the highest regard. His father, John Forbes Nash Sr., was an electrical engineer, and his mother, Margaret Nash, was a Latin teacher. When Nash was just a little kid, his parents could tell that there was something extraordinary about him. His sister Martha remarked, quote, "Nash was always different. My parents knew he was different, and they knew he was bright. He always wanted to do things his way." End quote. In his high school years, Nash stumbled upon the book that would forever alter the course of his life, E.T. Bell's Men of Mathematics. After reading it, he could independently prove a famous math theorem called Fermat's Theorem. John's parents saw how gifted he was with math, so they made sure to set him up nicely. They got him taking advanced math classes at the local community college during his last year of high school. Then he went to Carnegie Tech on a full scholarship. At first, he studied chemical engineering, followed by chemistry later on. However, midway through his second year, he became so hooked on math that it was all he spent his time on. Later, he got accepted into the top 4 math graduate programs in the US at the time: Harvard, Princeton, Chicago, and Michigan. A couple of math professors who believed in Nash's talents were pushing hard for him to go to Princeton, and one of them was Richard Duffin. He wrote a fantastic letter of recommendation where he straight up said, quote, "He is a mathematical genius." End quote. Nash officially stepped onto the campus of Princeton University to start as a grad student in 1948. But Princeton's math department back then was no joke. The department was filled with some of the brightest mathematical minds around, led by Solomon Lefschetz, who was known for developing the topological aspects of algebraic geometry. By the age of 22, Nash had completed his doctoral degree in mathematics, an extraordinarily rare achievement. His PhD was based on game theory introduced by 2 legendary figures, John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern. In the 28-page thesis, he took that original idea and laid the foundation for what became known as the Nash equilibrium. So to understand the Nash equilibrium, let's use the classic prisoner's dilemma scenario. Imagine 2 criminals who are arrested by cops. However, due to a lack of evidence, the cops find it difficult to find the real culprit. So they decide to separately interrogate the 2 criminals and tell each prisoner the same deal. If you confess and tell the truth, you'll walk free. But if you stay quiet while he confesses, you get a 10-year prison sentence. However, the plot twist is, if both prisoners refuse to tell the truth, they'll only get 1 year for minor charges. But if they both confess against each other, they'll get 8 years each, since their testimonies won't even be needed. So, in theory, the most brilliant move is for both criminals to stay quiet and only get that 1-year sentence, right? However, according to Nash's equilibrium theory, that's not what would happen in reality. Because the prisoners can't communicate with each other, Nash says that the most likely outcome is they'll both confess against each other. According to Nash, confessing guarantees you either total freedom or just an 8-year sentence. Staying quiet risks the full 10 years if the other criminal confesses. When you can't cooperate, confessing becomes the safer choice, even if it's not the best overall outcome. After getting his PhD from Princeton in 1950, Nash landed a teaching job at the prestigious Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His role there was as an instructor in the math faculty, primarily teaching undergrad math courses. Now, it was clear that Nash had an unconventional teaching style. In his first year of teaching, 30 students enrolled in his class. After just 1 semester, only 5 students still showed up. The way Nash dressed also definitely made him stand out. While most professors went for the traditional suit and tie look, Nash preferred baggy chino pants and sneakers, as he dressed more for doing manual labor than teaching at an elite college. His whole personality gave off this 1930s/1940s working-class American vibe, just with the sneakers upgrading it that little bit. As for his teaching methods, well, let's just say they were unique. According to Nash's colleagues at MIT, more often than not he'd spend the class lecturing on topics that had nothing to do with the actual course material, or he'd go way over students' heads with super advanced concepts that they hadn't even begun to study yet. Professor Sigurd Helgason remembered Nash advising the other math faculty to basically forget about teaching and to focus entirely on their own research instead, with one student even recounting, quote, "He gave a 1-hour test. He handed out blue books where you filled in your name and the course number on the cover. There were 4 problems. Problem number 1 was, what is your name? The other 3 problems were fairly hard. Since I knew by then how his mind worked, I made sure to write next to number 1, my name is Joseph Kahn. People who assumed that writing their own name on the cover was enough got 25 points taken off." End quote. Around that time, Nash's personal life took some interesting turns as well. He started a relationship with a nurse named Eleanor Steyer, whom he had met whilst admitting as a patient. They had a son together, John David Steyer. But once Eleanor told Nash that she was pregnant, he abandoned her due to her low social status. Later, Nash would meet his future wife, Alicia Lard Lopez Harrison, and despite being an atheist, they got married in February of 1957 in the Episcopal Church. Things started to go downhill for Nash in early 1959. His wife Alicia was pregnant with their son John at the time, but Nash's mental health was significantly deteriorating during this period. At first, it came across as paranoid behavior, but soon he turned extremely erratic and lost his hold of reality. One of the first people to notice something was significantly wrong with Nash was another famous mathematician and philosopher, Norbert Wiener. The problems with Nash's mental state started spilling over into his professional work. In early 1959, he gave a lecture at the Columbia University for the American Mathematical Society. The talk was originally supposed to present his proof for the Riemann hypothesis. But when Nash gave the lecture, it was totally incomprehensible. The audience immediately realized that something was wrong with Nash. It was clear that his mind was not in a good place. At one point, he concluded that all men wearing red ties were part of a communist conspiracy against him. He would later be hospitalized at McLean Hospital, where he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, sharing the same ward as the poet Robert Lowell, who also suffered from bipolar disorder. Due to his sudden mental trouble, Alicia decided to divorce Nash, but she didn't give up on him completely. She, along with her sister-in-law Martha, had him involuntarily committed to the New Jersey State Hospital in Trenton. From 1961 to 1970, Nash spent the majority of his time in various psychiatric hospitals receiving antipsychotic drugs as well as insulin coma therapy, which is no longer practiced today. According to John Nash, the start of his major mental disturbances and delusional thinking began in early 1959, right when his wife Alicia was pregnant with their son. He described it as a shift from rational, scientific thinking into the delusional mindset characteristic of paranoid schizophrenia. While Nash was prescribed antipsychotic medications, he admitted that he only took them under immense pressure from the doctors. As days passed, Nash refused to take any medication for schizophrenia for the rest of his life. In his own words, quote, "After my return to the dreamlike delusional hypotheses in the later 60s, I became a person of delusionally influenced thinking, but of relatively moderate behavior, and thus tended to avoid hospitalization and the direct attention of psychiatrists." As the years passed, Nash slowly recovered from his mental illness with the help of his ex-wife, Alicia. She encouraged him to live at home and spend time at the Princeton math department. During his recovery, Nash reported that he started hearing voices in his head again, but later on, he consciously chose to reject and ignore those hallucinations. However, due to his extended stay in a mental hospital, he was able to entirely renounce his dream-like delusional hypotheses, which he called enforced rationality. After 3 decades of mental turmoil, Nash regretted that he didn't fully reach his true potential as a mathematician due to losing the majority of his prime years. He famously wrote, quote, "I spent times of the order of 5 to 8 months in hospitals in New Jersey, always on an involuntary basis and always attempting a legal argument for release." End quote. By the 1980s, John Nash had made his way back to Princeton and was once again studying and working on mathematics. He would often audit undergraduate classes during this time. Among the students, especially the undergrads, Nash became known as the Phantom of Fine Hall. The students saw him as a mysterious, shadowy figure who would show up in the middle of the night and just start scribbling these incredibly complex mathematical equations on chalkboards in Fine Hall. To the students, he was bizarre, yet fascinating. While Nash was recovering from schizophrenia, his work on game theory was starting to get a lot of attention and now used in various fields like economics, political science, and even biology. So, the Nobel Prize Committee decided to award the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1994. Many criticized the committee for giving such a major award to someone who had suffered from severe mental illness, but the committee clearly felt that Nash's contributions to the field were so monumental that it overshadowed any concerns about his mental disorders. Later, he would go to receive the Abel Prize from King Harald V of Norway. But just days after being honored with the prize, the brilliant mathematician lost his life in a tragic car accident. Both Nash and his wife were on their way back home to Princeton after the trip. The taxi which they onboarded lost control and slammed into a guardrail on the side of the highway. His wife Alicia also died in the same crash. Towards the end of his life, Nash's friends described him as a humble, socially awkward man. He was quiet yet charming in his older years and never stopped working. He and his wife traveled all over the world, giving lectures and trying to develop new cooperative game theory concepts that built on his original breakthroughs. The discovery of old letters by the National Security Agency, or the NSA, written by Nash in the 1950s, adds another layer of fascination to his story. These letters reveal that Nash was ahead of his time, proposing foundational ideas of modern cryptography decades before they came into fruition. This occurred during a challenging period in Nash's life, particularly in early 1959 when his mental health began to decline significantly. While most of his life was derailed by his struggles with schizophrenia, the early and later stages of Nash's career were simply amazing. Nevertheless, Nash's legacy will forever be respected and considered a legendary figure in the field of economics. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.